He didn't leave because he stopped loving her. He left because staying meant slowly disappearing. Not all at once, but piece by piece, smile by smile, word by word, until one day, he looked in the mirror and couldn't recognize the man looking back. She didn't betray him, didn't abuse him. She just stopped seeing him. And after years of showing up for someone who stopped looking up, he asked the only question that mattered. What if no one comes to save me? Except me. He wasn't perfect, but he was present. He remembered the small things. Her coffee, her worries, her favorite way to be held. He worked hard, not just at his job, but in the relationship. He wasn't loud about it, but every action whispered, "You matter." For a while, it worked. She smiled more, held him tighter, said thank you without being prompted. And in those moments, he believed he was building something solid. But time has a way of testing even the strongest hands. Slowly, almost unnoticeably, the warmth began to slip away. Not instantly, not in a fight, not in betrayal, but in the quiet erosion of little things. The thank yous stopped. Her smile faded quicker. The touch became routine. What was once affection started to feel like an obligation. He didn't complain. He adjusted. He told himself she was tired, distracted, overwhelmed. He gave more. He tried harder. He carried more weight quietly. Because that's what men like him do. But deep down, he began to sense the shift. Not in her words, but in her silence. Not in her presence, but in the way her eyes no longer searched for his. She didn't leave him. She just stopped seeing him. Stopped noticing the man who built a life around her. The man who carried her worries like his own. The man who still remembered her coffee every morning. And that's when the real fear set in. Not the fear of being left. Not the fear of being alone. But the fear of becoming invisible. Invisible in the very room he built with his bare hands. Invisible in the love he poured every ounce of himself into. Invisible, while still standing right there. Because sometimes, the cruelest kind of loss is not when someone walks away, but when they stay and stop looking at you at all. At first, he thought, maybe she's tired. Maybe work is hard. Maybe this is just a phase. So he tried harder, made more dinners, listened longer, initiated conversations. He left notes on the counter. He stayed awake when she couldn't sleep. He asked questions, not because he needed answers, but because he wanted her to feel heard. Yet slowly, he noticed the shift. The gestures once met with warmth, now slipped by unnoticed. What once felt like love began to feel like labor. The more he gave, the less it meant. His consistency blended into the background. His devotion turned into routine. His kindness stopped being remarkable. It became expected. No more smiles of surprise. No more genuine thank you. Just silence. As if love were another chore checked off a list. And that silence spoke louder than any argument. Because indifference cuts deeper than anger. It doesn't ignite. It drains. He wasn't appreciated. He was consumed. Every effort is taken in, but rarely returned. Every sacrifice absorbed, but never acknowledged. And the cruelest part, he kept giving anyway, hoping that if he poured more into the cracks, the foundation would hold. But love doesn't thrive in expectation. It wilts. And in the quiet corners of his heart, he began to feel the erosion. Because when your love stops being noticed, when your gestures are no longer gifts, but obligations, It stops feeling like a connection. It starts feeling like a slow form of self-erasure. And erasure doesn't happen all at once. It happens moment by moment, dinner by dinner, gesture by gesture, until the man who once gave with joy starts giving only to survive in his own home. That's when he realized he wasn't just giving love anymore. He was giving himself away. He stayed longer than he should have, not out of weakness, but out of hope. He told himself, maybe this is just a season. Maybe tomorrow will be better. Maybe if I give a little more, she'll see me again. So he dimmed himself. He softened his voice. He swallowed his opinions. He hid his exhaustion behind a steady smile. He pushed his own needs aside, choosing silence over confrontation, choosing sacrifice over self-respect. And each time, he compromised. He lost another piece of himself. The hobbies he once loved gathered dust. The friends he once called drifted away. The laughter that once came easily grew rare. Until eventually, he wasn't fully there anymore. He became a role. Husband, provider, anchor. Not a man. Not a person. Just someone who helped her life work. He carried the weight of responsibility. But no one asked how heavy it was. He stood steady like stone. But no one wondered if he was cracking inside. He wasn't resentful. He wasn't hated. He was simply unseen. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest form of abandonment. Not when someone leaves, but when they stay and stop noticing you. The house still had laughter, but not his. The table was still full, but he felt empty. Life went on around him, but it didn't include him. And the longer he stayed, the deeper the wound is cut. Because love, without recognition, isn't love. It's labor. And no amount of effort can keep a man alive if no one bothers to see him as more than what he provides. He wasn't asking for perfection. He wasn't asking for praise. He was just asking to be seen. But instead, he stayed too long in a place where his presence became convenient. And his absence, it would only be noticed when the work was left undone. That is the pain of staying too long. Not the loss of love, but the slow death of being forgotten, while still standing right there. There wasn't a fight, no slammed doors, no screaming match. It was just a morning like any other. Coffee brewing, sunlight is creeping through the blinds. The same table, the same walls, the same silence. But something inside him shifted. He looked around the house, and it no longer felt like home. The pictures on the walls showed smiles, but he couldn't remember the last time those smiles were real. The bed was warm, but it had grown colder than the nights he once spent alone. And in that moment, the truth arrived. Gentle, but undeniable. I built this life, but I no longer live in it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't even sad. He was clear. He had nothing left to prove. He had already given years of effort, already sacrificed pieces of himself, already stayed longer than anyone else would have. He had nothing left to fix, because you can't fix what someone no longer sees. You can't repair what isn't recognized as broken. And he had nothing left to lose, except himself. That realization was the quietest kind of liberation. No drama, no revenge, no declaration of blame, just a man finally understanding that saving himself wasn't betrayal. It was survival. So he chose to walk away, not to run, not to punish, not to prove a point, but to return to the man he used to be before he was slowly erased, before his silence was mistaken for strength, before his kindness was mistaken for duty. He left quietly, not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough about himself to stop disappearing. And sometimes, the most powerful goodbye isn't shouted. It isn't written in anger. It's whispered through footsteps as a man finally walks back toward himself. In the first few weeks, he missed everything. The smell of her shampoo lingering on the pillow, the sound of footsteps moving through the hallway, the clink of dishes in the sink, the faint hum of another voice in the house. He missed the shape of routine, the rhythm of having someone there. Even when presence no longer meant connection, he missed the illusion of belonging, the comfort of being able to say we, even when the word no longer held meaning. But as the days stretched into weeks, the truth became clearer. There was as much as he didn't miss as there was. He thought he did. He didn't miss feeling invisible. He didn't miss being tolerated. As if his presence was an obligation rather than a gift, he didn't miss pleading for affection. Didn't miss sitting across a table, wondering if her silence meant anger, or if it simply meant indifference. He didn't miss the guessing game, trying to read her face, measure her tone, decode the distance in her eyes. He didn't miss the slow decay of intimacy, the way a touch became duty, the way a kiss lost its warmth, the way passion died quietly, but left him pretending it was still alive. And with time, he realized the grief wasn't for the love he had. It was for the love he kept hoping would return, the love he believed could be resurrected, if only he gave more, if only he had waited longer, if only he erased himself enough to make room for her again. But that love never came back. And slowly, the ache of missing her turned into the peace of not missing what had been lost long ago. Because the truth was simple. He didn't miss her absence of love. He only mourned the man he had become, trying to earn it. And once he let go of that illusion, he stopped chasing ghosts and started reclaiming himself. Healing didn't come quickly or cleanly. It came in waves. Some days, he woke up lighter. Other days, the weight of silence pressed harder than before. He went through the stages. Denial, whispering to himself that maybe she'd call. Anger, replaying every moment he felt unseen. Grief, mourning a future that would never be. Regret, wondering if staying had stolen too many years. But then, something shifted. Something powerful. He stopped blaming her. He stopped blaming himself. And instead, he started understanding. She loved him in the way she knew how. Maybe not fully. Maybe not consistently. But it was the best she could give. And he stayed. As long as he could. Not out of weakness, but out of hope. Out of loyalty. Out of the belief that love could heal cracks that was already too deep to mend. But sometimes, love isn't enough. Not when it requires the death of who you are. Not when staying means disappearing. So he chose to forgive. He forgave her. Not because she asked. Not because she admitted fault. But because he needed peace more than he needed closure. And he forgave himself. Not because he failed, but because he finally understood that leaving wasn't defeat. It was choosing to win differently. Forgiveness didn't erase the past. It didn't rewrite what had been lost. But it loosened the grip of bitterness. It set him free from carrying stories that no longer belonged to him. For the first time in years, his reflection in the mirror didn't look like a man waiting to be seen. It looked like a man who had seen himself again. And that was the beginning of real healing. Not by rewriting what happened, but by releasing the need to keep reliving it. He still loved her. He always will. Not romantically, not longingly, but respectfully. Because even in the unraveling, there were memories worth keeping. The way she laughed at small jokes. The way she once held his hand when the world felt heavy. The quiet mornings when just being together felt like enough. Those moments don't vanish. They live quietly inside him. Not as a chain, but as a chapter. And now he doesn't need to go back. Doesn't need to explain himself. Doesn't need to be missed in order to feel whole. He walks forward. Not rushing. Not chasing. Just steady. Alone. But not empty. Because solitude, to him, isn't absence. It's presence with himself. It's the rediscovery of who he is when he's not bending, not performing, not disappearing into someone else's shadow. He's not avoiding love. If it comes, it comes. But he will never again trade himself away just to keep it. For the first time in years, he's in love with his own life again. With the quiet mornings, with the simple evenings, with the routines that belong only to him. He finds love in the steady rhythm of his breath, in the clarity of silence, in the way peace feels stronger than passion ever did. And that is the kind of love that never leaves. Because it's not dependent on being chosen. It's not fragile, waiting for someone else to notice. It's not conditional on promises that may break. It is love rooted in self-respect, in presence, in the man he rebuilt, piece by piece. So when people ask, "Do you still love her?" he smiles gently. "Yes, I do, but differently." And when they ask, "Are you lonely?" he answers with a clarity they may not understand. "No, because I finally came home to myself, to the man who gave, and gave, and gave, and then finally looked at his own heart and said, 'You deserve something too. You're not selfish. You're not weak. You're not a quitter. You're a man who realized staying loyal to someone else should never mean betraying yourself. You didn't stop loving. You just stopped bleeding for love that didn't see you. And that choice, that quiet, courageous, soul-saving choice, that's what made you a man. Not the leaving, but the returning to yourself.